Welcome back to our Growing Experiment. We're here with Mike from Wild Meadows Farm. We invited Mike to come on the podcast for us to talk a little bit about current events in farming, a little bit about what his experience has been, and some thoughts on what he has, some thoughts on the future of farming. So, Mike, do you want to get started on introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Mike Doherty with Wild Meadows Farm. We're a regenerative farm in Grey County, Ontario. And we started this thing up about 5 years ago, my brother, myself, and my mom. And the business has been growing great since we started. It's turned into a real thing. And I also like to talk about our food systems and realities of farming and stuff like that. So that is what interests me.
Okay. And so for your business then, what is it exactly that you do? Like, what are your particular interests?
So our business, we raise ourselves grass-fed and finished beef. We do pastured pork, pastured chicken. We just kind of started selling that initially. We started with beef and pork. But then we thought, well, we know this guy who has honey down the road. There's a local fish farm. There's maple syrup and stuff like that. So we might as well sell that while we're at it, right? And then it kind of just expanded from there. So now we're to the point where so we raise our own beef, pork, and chicken, but we also carry stuff like bison, elk, honey, cheese, eggs, all kinds of stuff. And then we ship that pretty much all over Ontario.
Okay, so yeah, as well as being a producer, you're also kind of a hub for a lot of other producers.
Yeah, and that maybe it wasn't our intention when we started. We just kind of hit the ground running and figured it out as we went. But that's kind of where it went. So we started out at my mom's place. It's 90 acres. It's a lot of land. We're very lucky to have it, but there's only so much you can do on 90 acres. And so as we expanded and as we found more customers, we couldn't raise enough beef. So we started working with a couple other farmers that raise beef. In Ontario, in order to raise pasture chicken, you need to be part of the artisanal chicken program, which allows you to raise up to 3,000 chickens. And that's great, but we probably have a market for 12,000. So and it's a good thing. Like, it allows us to work with other farms, give other small farms a revenue source. So we work with a bunch of other smaller farms to bring in chicken. And then we have people, do you have bison? Do you have this? Do you have that? Can you get it? And so that's something else we've done, and we've tried to prioritize local. So everything comes from Ontario as local to us as possible. We do bring in wild caught fish from BC, just because that's a demand point for our customers. But everything we can source locally, we do.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a thing that we talk about a lot when we talk to a lot of the people that we talk to. And it's also good to have that sort of support where even if you can't get something like, say, the fish that you need to get from BC, it's better to get that and then get it through a local source provider that way. You made mention of your mother's farm and you guys kind of working with that. So there's farming in the family. Are you using similar processes to say what you brought up around? Are you using something a little bit different, or sort of how did that develop or grow?
Yeah. So myself and my two brothers, we grew up on the farm and whatever. And my parents, we had cattle and we'd hay in the summers and that sort of thing, but they made their money through their jobs. And so my mom was actually the farmer in the family. She grew up in rural Wisconsin on a small farm there. And they did things like made their own clothes, and they had a huge garden, grew most of their own food, that sort of thing. And then they moved here, and I think she convinced my dad to do the farming thing. But like I was saying, it's an extremely hard go to make a living on a small farm. So they both got town jobs. And that's just the way it was. I had a bunch of other friends growing up that had the same kind of thing. Their parents might have had 100 acres. But pretty much all the parents had a day job. And now, if I look at our area, it's pretty much Mennonites and cash croppers, very few 100-acre farms left anymore. And that's just the reality of the market. And so anyway, 5 years ago, my brother and I decided that we weren't really satisfied with the direction of our lives, really. Like, we're just kind of like we're doing what everyone else is doing, working a job and whatever. But we had this land, and so we convinced our mom to transition to grass fed and finished. So before that, she was just raising cows and selling them into the market. Some years she'd make decent money, some years not. But we transitioned to grass fed and finished beef, and we got 5 pigs that 1 year, and just selling to family and friends. And then from there, that was 2017, I believe. And from there, we've just been growing ever since. And we're doing pretty good up until 2020. Like we're going pretty steadily. And then all that broke out, and our business just went nuts. Like I was still working, my brother was still working, but the business grew like insanely in that year, and turned it in from a hobby thing to like a real business, which was great. I don't know how we got through it, but it was really, really great. And then, we've been growing ever since. There's a growing demand for local food. There's a growing demand for people to know where their food's from. I think there's more awareness about food, the importance of good quality food. And so, we just kind of struck at the right time.
Yeah, and I think we've noticed that a little bit too. Like a lot of the people we've talked to have also been fairly recent startups when it comes to getting into sort of this field. Some people having a background sort of similar to you, and some people having no real background at all and just really seeing it as being like a market demand, almost kind of like how you pointed out there.
Totally.
So, and then you also made a mention though too of how hard it is to really sort of be a farmer, in the sense that, I mean, you don't really make a whole lot of money doing it. It's a whole lot of work and all that kind of a thing. And so like one thing I often think about is like, you know, I like seeing people like you doing what you're doing. I think that more people doing what you're doing, like say many more smaller farms, I think of, and now this might be because I don't know how the real food market works, but ideally I see like more people like you doing what you're doing, more people buying more locally, more sort of, I view that as being a resilient food chain because it's more local. They're shorter chains. You have less distance between the actual food production and the actual market, all these kind of things. So with that kind of thinking, what are the main hurdles to kind of farming in that way? Like, so like how does, I guess I'm kind of saying too much at one time. What's the state of farming now with that? So like how is it working out for farmers now? What's their main hurdle? Like what stops smaller farmers versus what helps bigger farmers, I guess?
Okay. Well, like I think the way farming has gone and will continue to go, in my opinion, is like there's a bit of a divergence. Like there's going to be the small farms. There's more and more demand for that, which is great. But I think the big farms will just continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the bigger farms are just driven by the economy, like by the market. So they have to have economies of scale. They have to be big. The little guys, like if you have 500 acres, 1,000 acres, you're on the small end. You either need to rent land or buy more land or whatever, maybe get bought out eventually. And that's just the way it is. Just the market drivers for that. But from a small farm perspective, it's great because there is a lot of demand. A lot of people want to know where their food's coming from. They're more aware of it. I would say the market is the biggest challenge, and I think that's one reason we've been so successful. We've found the right people. We've developed a delivery system, so we make it convenient. It gets delivered right to people's door. But the market is one of the biggest challenges. So, like we're not getting rich by any means, but we've developed a business that can support ourselves. There's lots of other farmers doing similar work that maybe both of them work like town jobs, and they're trying to get this going on the side. One works a town job, that sort of thing. But there are definitely more and more success stories out there. And I think as long as people continue to seek that sort of thing out, there'll be more and more. And the expectations around food, like we've been conditioned to kind of want convenience. I am too. Like I'm not criticizing. It's just, we want everything perfect and nice and convenient. And so it is a challenge, but these are all obstacles that are achievable for sure.
Okay. So like it's like there's a lot of positive change in the way that there are people who are moving towards your sort of marketplace, because I guess you kind of have to look at them as being different marketplaces. The mass market versus it's kind of a sort of a niche market, this artisanal farming and that kind of thing. So it's going to happen over time. It's a slow evolution.
It is a slow. It's growing rapidly, but like we're still, I don't know, but like less than 0.5% probably in terms of market share. That's a guess. I don't know. It might be bigger or smaller, but not very big. But it is, in terms of percentage growth, it is growing pretty rapidly, which is exciting. Yeah.
Did you find business got more busy once you started the delivery system? Because I'm just thinking about how we were talking about convenience, and, you know, I could see that some people would pay more attention, like, oh, I could get that delivered to my door. That's what I'll do.
Yeah. I would say it definitely helped us grow. Like, when we're in the middle of nowhere, well, kind of in the middle of nowhere. We're about 2 hours from Toronto. So we're within a driving distance, but it's not convenient for people to come out to the farm. Like local people do, but the majority of our customers are GTA. And so when we were first starting out, we're like, okay, well, how are we going to get people their food? Like it wasn't like we had this big elaborate plan to deliver door to door. And we tried a bunch of different things. Like we said, you can come to the farm, or we try to do drop-off points, stuff like that. But it just really wasn't working. And then I just decided, well, I'm just going to take it to people's door and see how that goes. And that really improved things. Now, I did it myself for a while, and that was crazy, but it worked. It allowed us to build a customer base. And then eventually we found someone locally who had a bit of a business going, doing pickups and drops for other local stores. And so we told them, like, we have this market, we can develop our routes through you, and we can work together, and that's worked out fantastic.
Yeah, and that's kind of a good idea too. Like it's maybe it's not exactly reflective, but it kind of reminds me of like the whole Uber rideshare idea, right? Like there's local sort of small scale people who have the capacity to do local small scale delivery kind of thing, right? Like they don't have to hit every restaurant or whatever, but they could probably operate for a few farms and make that sort of connection happen. And that's probably got to be one of the biggest challenges for a smaller farm, is really getting to the marketplace, because I know a lot of the farmers we talk to, they have to go to farmers markets and stuff. And in a lot of cases, you're talking a half hour to maybe an hour to 2 hours, right? And that's, 2 hour trip, and that's time off the farm and all these other things, right? So getting the food from the farm to the actual person is key.
Yeah. And like from a farmer's market, like it's also prep work. It's also like you don't know what you're going to sell, so you have to take it there. Maybe you don't sell as much, and you got to take it and pack it back and all that stuff. So yeah, we were gearing up to do that in 2020, and then it turned out we didn't need to. So yeah. You mentioned challenges. Another challenge that I don't really see going away, it might get worse, I hope it doesn't, is regulation. So like I mentioned the chicken thing, so we can raise 3,000 chickens ourselves legally, which is great, but it's not enough to have be its own enterprise. So it's good, but it's just a supplemental thing. That's what it's designed to be. So that's a restriction on what we can do that way. If you look at eggs, like there's some farms in the States that are doing great things with pastured eggs. Like they're growing the business. They're raising like not relatively few chickens, but they're growing a business, and they can do basically just laying hens. We here can only raise 100. You can only have 100 laying hens on your farm legally. And then you can't sell those eggs unless people come directly to your farm gate. So one thing we're looking at doing is, in order to legally sell your eggs, you need to put in an egg sorter, or they need to be sorted. So we're going to put in an egg sorting machine, like as simple as possible, and we're going to sort our own eggs, but then we're also going to buy from other local farms, so we can distribute pastured eggs through our distribution model, which is great. There's a big demand for it, but like all those hurdles in the end increase costs. So it costs us more to do, and it creates a higher price for the customer at the end of the day.
Yeah, so like I wonder with that, like is the right way to go to try to get like the regulation changed, or is the right way sort of doing cooperative in a way like how you're doing, where like say you make the investment where you're getting the sorter, which allows you to like do a bigger process more eggs, right? Where you can incorporate more farms, and that's you kind of need that volume to justify the sort of investment, right? So is that kind of a way? Because that I hear a lot of that when it comes to small business versus big business. It's that barrier of entry to play. A lot of it's got to do with the regulations, right? And that's the other kind of problem I have with a lot of that stuff too, is like, you know, you have a whole bunch of money, so then you can kind of pay people to go make sure that regulations work in your favor. And of course you're going to do that because you're in the business of making money. And I mean, unfortunately, the structure of our politics is it's basically pay to play. You know, not all votes are basically equal. You can cast a ballot and all that kind of stuff, but it doesn't mean the guy in the office is going to do what you want him to do. He's going to do what the lobbyist gave him millions of dollars to do. And it might not be directly, but I'm kind of getting carried away with that. But so what do you do there? Is it, do you try to collect the farmers and try to work on changing regulation? Do you try to work in cooperative?
Well, I think the idea of changing regulation, like, for example, the artisanal chicken program where you can raise 3,000, it used to be, and this is before my time, I don't know what it was, but it used to be maybe 100 or 500. I'm not sure, but it used to be you could only raise a much smaller amount, and there was pressure put on so that we can raise 3,000. So that's good. So I guess it's theoretically possible. I'm a little pessimistic about how much you can change that stuff, but it's not, I don't know, it's probably worth trying, I guess. But I think the cooperative model is the way, at least in the interim, to go.
And it's not to say you can't do both, right? You get these sort of cooperatives working where you get these smaller scale farms working. And then while you sort of help these smaller scale farms, in theory, grow a little bit in these cooperatives, you can also sort of maybe hopefully lobby a little more weight in the local area, like try to get a local representative who can actually try to do something. Or I wonder, like, you know, how the way to go about that to make a real impact is, right? Because, you know, I have a bit of a pessimism when it comes to dealing with like your representatives. Is like, you know, there's only so much they can do, and there's this bigger scale idea of what's going on, right? Especially when you're dealing with a big industry like food. Like we're talking about a lot of money, and we're talking about, again, this. It's not even just as simple as food, because a lot of the food that we even grow in this country, like say, or not even food is the proper word, but a lot of the crops we grow, like say all of the canola seeds we grow, or canola seed oil we grow, right? Or the rapeseed oil, or whatever you call those plants, right? We grow a ton of that. That's all going all over the world. And it's partly because, you know, we trade a little with this country, they trade a little with, it's a little more of a tit for tat kind of equity kind of thing than it's got anything to do with really feeding people. It's more about sending stuff all over the world to make money.
Yeah, it's from a farmer's perspective, if they know they grow canola and they can make so much per ton or whatever, they're gonna do it. Like that's probably
of course. I don't put that on the farmer. The farmer has to do what they have to do in the market. Like, I mean, from what I understand, there was a big change really in how farming was conducted after World War II. It became much more industrialized and on a much larger scale. And shortly after, if not too long after, basically there was a big movement to, at least in the States, move to bigger and bigger farms. And it was like, you know, if you're a small or a middle guy, we don't really have any time or money for you because, and the thing is too, is you can see this because you see what happens when you have countries go from being little industrialized to greater industrialized. Or say take China, right? You know, they're going to do whatever they can to lift those people out of poverty. So they're going to spend the resources, they're going to use the cheap energy, they're going to do whatever they can, and everyone makes a whole bunch of money. And you look in China now, and they have a huge middle class. And that's just a reflection of what happened exactly over here in North America, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
And partly that's fueled by this farming, but partly that's fueled by the excess of machinery we had because of the war effort and the access to cheap and easy fertilizers, which were basically a fossil fuel byproduct, right?
And if you look at what's happening or seemingly happening, that access to cheap inputs is going away. And so, like, what are the consequences of that from from a farming perspective locally, from a global perspective, from just food production, like we've addicted ourselves to cheap, really cheap inputs and become so technological in our farming that if something happens, the same as the supply chains, like one little thing happens in the supply chain and it blows up. Like if one thing or a couple things in the chain and as far as monocrop massive agriculture goes wrong, that's going to really affect the world in many ways. And it kind of looks like that's going to happen. I have no idea if that's real, but we'll see.
Yeah, because even if you just think like, say all things else being well, right? Like say you have good weather and all this kind of thing, even if a bunch of the market doesn't have access to fertilizer in the way that they did before, and say that results in like a 10% less yield overall or more in different places, like you're talking about the people in the most vulnerable places in the food chain starving to death.
Totally.
Right? Like, it's, like here in Canada where we have all the land and all this kind of stuff, we'll probably be all right, but there's a lot of countries in the world, and from what I understand too, a place like China imports a great deal of their food. So even though like they have sort of set up their system what they have right now, when fertilizer gets more expensive there too, they're going to be affected just as much as anybody, because while they don't even have decent land to sort of begin with, they're totally sold on fertilizer. And from what I understand in South America, they're much of the same case. Like they're very, very reliant on this fertilizer.
Yeah. And there's major issues like the deindustrialization in Europe and the consequences of that from a fertilizer production standpoint, from like the chemicals they use, even though I don't agree with the chemical use, like we need it from a global food production standpoint. Like there's some major problems there that, again, I don't know who to believe. Like it's hard to really know, but it could be bad.
Well, and that's another reason why we were drawn to what you were posting on your page, because we have a lot of the same sort of concern that you were sort of seem to be talking about or thinking about. And I wonder with that too, like I understand why people are trying to do what they're trying to do in the way of environmentalism and stuff like that. But for me, at least, and well, this is my idea. I mean, we want the planet to be like a good place because we want it to be good for people. And, you know, if we have to like make changes that are going to like really put people in a very bad way, and like it's because like I read a lot of history, and so like if you go back a few hundred years, like starving to death, not even a few hundred years, like you go back 100 years, starving to death was a real threat all the time. It still happens in a lot of countries. It hasn't happened for generations in this country, thankfully. But like I think people are so like, well, why don't we just totally change the way we do everything 100%? It's like our society, the way it exists today, the size that it exists at today is totally because of these very specific things that happen in a very specific way. And if you take one of these pillars out, we don't know in what way this is all going to fall apart. But like, it's like at the very least, you have to ask that question.
I agree. And like, I'm all for change and progress and all that stuff. And I think like some of the ideas that some people have, we probably should think about doing that or doing it as best we can. But yeah, like if you're going to make all these wholesale changes and you're putting entire populations at risk, like why are you really doing it? Like, and one of my biggest arguments against doing all this stuff is like, are you really going to entrust these like obviously corrupt politicians to do this for you? Like that's the part that I have a really hard time with.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting too because like for me, like I study a lot of history and I study a lot of philosophy and like politics and this kind of thing. And if you look at like all of the critiques of like of power, especially in the last 100 years, every person who's ever thought about politics or thought about the structure of power, they're like the people who have the power are almost always corrupt. Especially in certain systems, right? Like you're just going to see it happen because when there's a whole bunch of money and there's a whole bunch of power, people who want money and power go there. Now, we've just decided for some reason that the people we give all the money and power to are the most altruistic people that have ever walked the face of the planet. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't good people out there and there aren't people who do their very best to make their country and everyone's lives better. But I'm saying, like, maybe we're being a little bit naive to suspect that where you have the most money and the most power, that you're not going to have at least a few sociopaths or people who are with misaligned intentions.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's on one end, it's really interesting to watch, but it's scary as well. But that, like, it is what it is. I can't change anything. I rant on my social media sometimes, but like, I'm not going to change anything, but I might maybe make some people think a little harder about like what they're doing, what they can do, how they can make themselves a little more resilient, that sort of thing. So I think that's important. I think the more people who kind of have that mindset, the better off we'll all be. So yeah, that's kind of why I post what I post.
Yeah, I think it's similar to us doing the podcast, right? We just want to have people think about this stuff, right? So talking to you about this, maybe somebody's going to listen and think a little bit differently about something, or not, right? But it gives the opportunity for critical thinking, and I think that's something that's undervalued nowadays, and we really need to promote that.
And like with all the craziness, I think I don't know to what extent it's waking people up, or it's making people think a little harder about what's actually happening, and that is a good thing. Like that is a good consequence of what's happening. So yeah,
it's kind of like the paradox of the way the world works. It seems like, it's like what makes things good is actually hard stuff in a way. It's like, it's almost like the gym principle, right? If you want to have a strong body, you have to push the body beyond where it normally goes. And that means being very uncomfortable a lot of the time, for depending on how strong you want to be, right? And then you also kind of see that principle of like, how far you push it to a certain point, because you push too far, you hurt yourself. But how far you push it, that'll develop how far you can grow, how big you can get, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. It's the same sort of principle, right? These like people kind of have to be made uncomfortable to be made to grow. And then they start to think like, oh, hey, I noticed that my grocery bill is an extra 20% or 30%. What would it cost me to grow tomatoes? I notice I eat a lot of those. And just even those little small changes, I think makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and we become accustomed to easy and convenient, which are all good things, but like you can become complacent in that. And when you look at it from a food standpoint, like the vast majority don't think about it. They just go to the grocery store and they buy their food. And like if that system were to go on in like forever, and it was good food and all that, like that's great. I think that would be the most ideal situation. But people are dependent on that. They're dependent on cheap food. It looks like food prices are going to continue to go up. So now those people are in a very hard spot. And we also maybe naively just believe that if it's on the shelf or whatever, and it has the expiry date and it has the nutrition information, that it's good for you, or it's fine, like it's been tested and someone's taking care of that. You don't have to think about that. But like, I think that's one reason why business has grown so much, is people are becoming more and more aware of food and the importance of the quality and stuff like that. So I guess we're talking about how when things are too easy and you don't take personal responsibility, you're leaving yourself open to all kinds of possibilities.
Yeah, well, like there's so many of these different cliches that are popping into my head, like steel sharpens steel. You want to make something like a sword or something like that. You heat it up really hot and you hammer on it like on an anvil. Everything that's like worth having always has some kind of work attached to it. It always has some kind of like there's no free rides. No. And I think in a way too, because we've had such abundance and such privilege with our abundance for such a long time, we just expect that it should be like that forever. And why can't we just give everyone a luxury ride, sort of like a lot of the people in this country have been able to have? And it's also like, when this big boom starts happening, you have the baby boomers, which is a huge population growth. And that's another thing people don't think about, like a huge population growth. And then you basically have like an inverted pyramid when it comes to population growth for the whole country. And the only way you can stem that is basically by huge immigration. And And that's exactly why the government has to bring in, I think, like 800,000 people a year. It's because nobody's having any kids here. And like, you have to have people in here working and producing stuff so we can actually have an economy, so we can export stuff. Because from what I understand, the government, all they care about is like how much money they can basically ship out versus how much comes in. It's basically a GDP ratio. And as long as that's above a certain percent, that's a success. I mean, it doesn't really care how much inflation there is and how much it bleeds the middle class out. That just seems to be the game, right?
It seems so. But yeah, as like a parent, like we have 2 kids and you guys have 2 kids, it is concerning. Just thinking about what's going to be like in 20 years, 30 years. But yeah, I don't know.
Well, I think that's why we're doing what we're doing, right? Trying to build something for our kids.
Trying to figure it out too. Like, I think this is even like this is the start of what changes kind of are in a way, right? You get together with people who have like minds. You start, like, basically what's kind of happened here in a way is like a lot of people are like, something's wrong, right? Like there's a problem here, right? And everyone's kind of getting together being like, have you guys noticed something's weird? Like something's not right? And we're all like, yeah, what's not right though? And you know, you can't blame us for taking a little while to figure it out, but it's a very complicated problem, especially when you start thinking, well, I thought it was this, and it seemed like it was that, but then all these things kind of come together, and it's actually a mix of these things and those things and whatever else. But I think that's what we're kind of trying to do. And when you're trying, you know, you start off clumsily and then you get better at it, but trying to figure out, you know, what are we going to do in the way, like, you know, and I think this is kind of the right idea. Figure out, you know, more local food sources, more local sourcing, more resilience in that matter.
And like when you start, like you said, you fumble, like you just start and you do things wrong and then you figure it out. Okay, I need to do it a little different. But as long as I think you're moving forward, there's all kinds of opportunity, especially now, like because maybe so few people are on board right now. So there's all kinds of opportunity there. But at the same time, there's more and more and more all the time seeing things. And like, so there is a lot of opportunity. And I think you have to keep that faith to like believe in positive outcomes and yeah, moving forward.
Well, and I think it's the attitude too of like building even, right? Where like when I think about like what I would sort of relate a lot of what's going on sort of culturally here in the West for us, we have a very destructive sort of attitude right now. We're very focused on destruction on a bunch of different levels, and I think the antidote to that is kind of like learning how to build stuff, because building is like literally putting stuff together, and like culturally we're always talking about how things should be pulled apart in a sense, or how they're different parts of a whole in a sense, and it's like. A lot of times the most important part of a functioning mechanism is like the whole of the functioning mechanism. And so it's like, well, can we build stuff? Can we do stuff? And then we can, like, you know, people, we all come together under these like projects. We need shit to do. We need to like come together and work on something. Yeah. And so like, I feel like you said, there's lots of opportunities here, and the more people get into it, the more opportunities they are. And that makes me feel a little optimistic for the future, even though I think like there might be some mishandling if I'm being generous at the upper levels of our sort of structure here. But I think there's legitimate grassroots people sort of in movement who are making efforts in the right direction and getting better and getting good.
And like to make change, you don't need everybody. You don't even, I don't think you even, like, I forget what percentage it is.
Like 15% maybe.
Yeah, like there's that curve, right?
Yeah.
Like it's, and I agree with you about the building, and it kind of, that one thing and the whole thing is the most important part, but then inevitably you'll have other things that build off that or are related and work off of that, and that can snowball. But I think, like, in terms, like you said, everything is geared around destruction, and I think I agree. But it's more, it's geared around being mechanized. Everything is this is that, this is how this works, and it is that way, and this is that way, and the world doesn't work like that. Nature doesn't work like that. It's all so connected, but we've forgotten that. Whether that's on purpose or not, I'm not sure. But like we need to come back to the whole interconnection of like us and the land, or even us as farmers and the animals, and how we're all connected and working together. I think that's part of it anyway.
Well, it's kind of logically, it's like the logical progression of the sort of scientific method in thinking, right? Like you want to break everything down to its sort of constituent parts and look at those individual parts, right? And so like our society sort of reflects that in a way that we've all become sort of atomized. We're all sort of broken down into our little parts, where even families mostly, I would wager, mostly engage on a more like immediate family basis, right? Like you might interact with your parents and maybe like your sisters and your brothers and stuff like that, but you're probably not seeing your aunts and uncles that often, and you're probably not seeing your cousins like ever, if you even have that many, because the family sizes are so much smaller too. And so, and then because a lot of people are spending time at home because of the endless entertainment. Like, you know, you don't have to go anywhere to be entertained for like forever now. You can go on a million adventures. If you want to know everything there is to know about the Amazon or whatever, you can find a bunch of documentaries and a bunch of stuff and just sit in your house and never leave. And that's all. So you become these very individualized units that are totally apart from each other. And I think that's another thing that we're sort of coming to realize too, as a culture too, that like we're not really a whole anymore. We're basically a whole bunch of different little things doing different little things. And I think there's going to be sort of a restructuring. I think what you're going to see is like, you know, and it's probably going to cohere around like value structure. Like you're probably going to say like people, especially in like the food space, right? People are going to realize like, oh, I think food is really important. And you're going to see a cohesion sort of around that space. And I think different groups that value different things will sort of build up around that. So like it's cool. It'll be a dynamic time. With that dynamism comes a lot of uncertainty and potential risk. But like what you do is you just try to insulate yourself as much as you can, right?
The thing is, like, the last 3 years have really opened my eyes, and I think opened a lot of people's eyes to just how the world works, and or at least partially anyway. I'm sure there's lots I don't understand or don't know, but just in general, like how things work. And maybe something like this, although maybe not as drastic, but a change was needed no matter what. Like, and this is accelerating it, and it's scary, but it is forcing you, if you want to maybe find other people that are like-minded, or move in the direction that you're actually meant to, rather than wasting your time in a desk job kind of thing. So like I said, there's positives. There's huge positives in all this. It's just embracing that and trying not to focus too much on the scary bits.
And that reminds me too, when you were talking about like people thinking about like, you know, what's right and what's wrong and this and that kind of thing. It's like, well, I might put words in your mouth there, but anyways, the point I was thinking about is like, you know, people thinking about the idea of like, you know, what's true. Like, you know, we've had that as being an idea in the last couple of years, right? You know, where there's been a lot of contention around the idea of what is true, what's not true, what's a source of valid truth and not truth, right? And I think a lot of people have this still sort of idea in their head that there's true and untrue, right? And that we can have like sort of the total understanding of a particular thing and then perceive it truly, right? But then when you start really asking that question, you're like, oh, well, you know, what do you mean by true exactly? Because then when you start looking into like facts, you can present facts and stats, the same exact numbers in 3 or 4 different ways and present entirely different messages. And then based off of that, if you use that same data and input it into a different model, which you hear a lot of this on the news too, you'll hear modeling. So they're running this into some kind of computer algorithm. And I'm not saying they don't have their place. I'm sure they certainly do.
Sure.
But it's like these numbers, they're open to manipulation. This idea that you can just totally grab a hold of truth in our reality as if you can go out and pick a rock out of your backyard, it's a little more slippery than that.
And I think if something is open to manipulation, like pretty much everything is, or there's potential for corruption or whatever, like people should be allowed to ask questions, even if they're far out there, even if they're going against the grain, whatever. Like you need to allow that. I think like there are obviously problems, but I think one thing is people just don't believe anything anymore, and that there's also negatives there. Like you might be stuck not believing something which is actually true, because it's like the boy who cried wolf kind of thing, right?
Yeah, and then like you're saying there, people don't know what to believe. You could also have a culture fall into total nihilism that way too, right? Because if they can't find any truth in anything, they might presume there's no truth at all. And then if there's no truth at all, how do you orient your life? And then you can go, there's a whole negative loop that goes off of this. And I mean, this is something that Nietzsche talked about, and this is something that people have been talking about for well over 100 years. And this is not an insignificant problem. So, you know, people have to have some sort of foundational stone to orient themselves from. Like,
especially the young people who need to like go and find their purpose and do all that stuff, and like coming up in this world, like, yeah, that it'd be easy to just assume everything is just nonsense and get down. And but yeah, I agree. And maybe that's another reason why talking about this stuff is so important, because if we're talking about it, there's probably other people that are thinking it.
Yeah, and that's what I wonder too, and that's what I hope, is that a lot of people, like, because like there's a lot of potential in this space. There's a lot to be done. I feel like there's a lot of good people with a lot of good intentions, and I feel like there's a lot of good that could be done. Like, you know, like, I don't know. I'm really optimistic about it, but I feel like there has to be a lot of willingness to have conversations. And then in some cases, it probably gets to where you're going to have uncomfortable conversations, or kind of out there conversations. Like if you're trying to talk about, you know, truth, right, and your relation to truth, and then sort of sources of truth. Let's hypothetically say that if you were to be talking to a person and then had credible evidence to suggest that, like, you know, sources of information that you normally thought were credible were actually not credible, and you could dictate a case of saying, like, you know, well, here's where this source of information has actually been inaccurate and actually, you know, lied a few times. And you can say, well, so that suggests that this source of information is not very credible. Mm-hmm. You know, the problem with that is it also has a destabilizing effect on that whole person's paradigm, right? You're not just telling them something that is true. You're kind of in a way messing up their whole life. And this is sort of what I think is that Plato talks about in the cave, right? It's like you try to show the person who's been watching the reflections from the flame on the cave wall that you take them out of the cave and you say, no, this is reality. There's people out here and there's a whole world. They'll tell you that's all demons and this and that, and they'll run back in the cave as quick as they come out.
Especially when you've been we've all gone to school, right? Like going to school, public school, high school. Like I did university, I did master's. Like there's so much stuff there that you accept as truth, and the people presenting it probably thought it was truth, but like looking at it now, I'm like, well, that's just nonsense. But like to come to that conclusion is a very hard thing. You have to be willing to kind of step outside of your ego and look at it, which is, I don't know if a lot of people can do that.
Well, and that actually highlights an important reason, or an important point where you think about, like, what would be the problem with, say, these institutions when you have people who are invested in a certain way of thinking, build literal careers on it, and then someone comes in and says that this whole thing that you've been studying, and then, in fact, if it's a newer field of study, you could say, actually, this whole new field of study is total pseudoscience and crap, and I can sort of show you how or why. Well, that person is, of course, going to fight with every ounce of their being to tell you you're wrong, because you've taken the cornerstone out of their life's work and watched the thing crumple and laughed at them.
Yeah.
So what do you think they're going to do?
Well, no, it's human nature, right? So.
And that's that ego point that you're making. Like, you have to be able to think, like, if that were me, if you're honest, would you want someone being like, hey, this little, you know, you had this cool idea. You know, you had this big structure you built. This thing right here, this load-bearing beam, is actually crap. And I don't know if you noticed that. And they point that out, and it's almost like that beam cracks.
Totally.
And then it wants to fall over.
Especially when your income is dependent on it. I think that's a big part of all this. Like, we all need income to feed ourselves and house ourselves and whatever. So, right? So.
Yeah, it's and that way too. When you talk about it, if you do it with some humility, in a way you can see where people make bad decisions for bad reasons and stuff, but you still got to be like, you know, in that situation, you can understand why you made that decision. Totally. Like, you know, you can kind of forgive it or accept it in a way, but it doesn't excuse poor behavior. But, like, you know, you still have to have that level of humility when you deal with, because it's complicated, right? This whole human experience.
Totally. Yeah, we're far more complicated than I think people want to admit. But I think that's one reason why entrepreneurship is so important, and supporting people who are willing to take that leap, because it gives them independence and it lets them create their own thing, right? And it's like, yeah. So I think that's one reason why supporting just the small business, the entrepreneur, or the business, maybe it doesn't maybe have to be small, but the business is doing things the right way. I think that's because if more people supported that stuff, fewer people would have that economic driver to maybe do things that maybe they know deep inside of them that they shouldn't be doing, but they don't have a lot of other options.
Well, and that's the sort of like people are very quick to point out the shadow side of sort of consumer market and capitalism and that sort of way. But the positive side to that, in a sense, is that if you are a very conscious consumer and you spend very appropriately, you can influence the market in a certain way, especially if you accrue more capital, right? So
Yeah.
like, you
Yeah,
think about where you're using your resources and what you're using and all that kind of thing. That's how you kind of make weight in there. And so making these choices where you're buying more local encourages more local market because there's more money there.
Totally. But it's hard, and you can order from Amazon and it's there that day, or you can just go to the grocery store and get everything you need, even stuff you didn't think you needed.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
you have to completely change your mindset when you're trying to be local.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah, but even that too is one thing that I kind of liked about it though too is just on the meat end, it's I love having a freezer. Doesn't matter if the grocery store is shut down now for a week, 2 weeks, I don't care. I have food.
Yeah.
It's just there.
That's the way.
I knew where it comes. I knew where it come from. I know the farmer. I talked to him, all that kind of thing. It's
Awesome.
I got food, and it's just it's having that security where it's and then the only other thing you got to kind of worry about in a sense, it's in the freezer. All right, so that means you got to worry about keeping the freezer running because if the power goes out, then you got no food. And you kind of figure that out, and then now you're a little more stable. Now you're well, if something goes bad, I can wait this out a few days here, and then you got more options, right?
That makes a world of a difference too. You don't have to worry about so much. You can focus on what you need to.
Yeah, even just the skill of gardening that we're trying to progress and make better. Even just having that skill is huge when it comes to self-reliance. Totally.
And so many people, it's amazing. It's not that hard, but it's not a lost skill, but it's not a skill that everyone has anymore. I'm lucky. My mom grew up eating out of a garden. She kept a garden going at our place, even though she worked full time. But I have a ton I should learn from her.
Yeah, well, I know it's something for us too, because we don't have a lot of land or nothing like that, but we grew a decent amount of stuff last year, and I think this year too we have a much better plan. We learned that for sure, and that's the other thing too. When you start thinking more seriously about food production, your time horizon must be a lot longer. You can't think about what am I having for dinner tonight, really. You're more thinking what am I having for dinner for the next 3 months, at least, right? And
for the year, really.
Yeah, well, and then say if you're operating a farm or doing production for animals and stuff, you're thinking you've got a certain amount of animals that are this age and this age and this age, and you're rotating out this stock and that kind of thing. You're spinning a whole lot of tops, and you have to be thinking probably at least 4 or 5 years in advance.
Yeah. Well, for sure, as a business and as a farm, you need to do that sort of thing. We have pretty detailed plans for next year, and then it kind of becomes less detailed as you go on, so you can change. But yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, you can't be too rigid either, right? Because especially we were just talking about, everything's very uncertain right now. You need to have that flexibility to be able to pivot and go where you need to go, or have even that little bit of cushion where if times get a little tough, and because from what I understand, when it comes to the Bank of Canada, they're going to be raising rates again. We're going to see. They just keep saying there's going to be an increase in food price. So it's just going to happen. Food's going to get more expensive. It's going to get harder for people because one thing I'll say to some guys I work with, I'm maybe some of you guys got a raise this year, maybe some of you guys didn't, but everybody basically took at least a 10% pay hit.
Yeah, totally.
Right?
And that goes back, like food prices in the grocery store is that's going to be at least partially dependent on the global world, right? Like grain prices will be dictated by the global markets and whatever. But I think that's another reason why going local, finding someone local, is important, because like our prices will be affected for sure, but I don't think our prices will be affected as much as the global markets, or as much as the grocery stores. And maybe just deciding that you don't have to have an orange in January, like you can eat more seasonally and stuff like that. Just getting used to that idea.
Yeah, and like the other thing too, like that's been kind of nice about our experience with getting into gardening and stuff too, is there's lots of people to talk to. It kind of helps bring us together with like the older members in Sophia's family too, because they all garden, so they like to come over and see what we're doing. We like talking about like, how'd this do for you this year? How'd this do? And then reaching out to the other people that we reach out to. There's this whole other thing that's on top of that. And then when you're doing the harvesting and stuff, like Sophia's mom comes over, helps do some of the food processing. Me and my dad made a bunch of pickles there this year when he come down to visit when our son was born. You know, there's, and we've talked about this lots on the podcast, that old idea of breaking bread, right? Like food is what brings people together. So it's like there's all these sort of additional benefits that are sort of auxiliary. They're sort of like periphery in a way, right? And it's like, I don't know. I just feel like there's a lot of good momentum behind this, and it's like you said, we're still playing a global game. Like, say when you think about grain, right?
Yeah.
Think about how much of like the North American diet is basically grain.
Totally.
It's like a lot, like probably close to half.
Yeah. Well, and then you consider the grain that is fed to animals. Like,
Yep.
that's a lot more.
Yeah, because like, and then you think about say like corn and stuff like that. Like a lot of people grow a ton of corn, but a lot of that gets turned into like some kind of high fructose corn syrup, and then a whole bunch of that doesn't even go there. It actually just gets fed to animals.
And ethanol. Like
and ethanol, yeah, right, because that's part of the subsidy of the fuel there, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it's all going to get more expensive, but I mean, yeah, that's what you got to do. You got to kind of start figuring about like, you know, what you're going to do to counteract that. And I mean, yeah, I don't know. It kind of is what it is in that way. Like, right, you can only do what you can do, and like you said too, there are certain trends that are kind of going a certain way where there's not much a local person or a small person can do, because you're talking about a process that takes how many years to correct, right? It's like,
yeah.
And you're talking about almost trying to like hold back a tsunami kind of tidal wave of like everyone's doing this thing, and you're like, actually, I kind of think maybe that's a bad idea. And they're like, well, obviously, what the hell do you know? Because there's a whole bunch of us.
Yeah, exactly. You're just a simple farmer.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. But I do think you can affect change locally. I do believe that. I think you can have a real effect locally. And like local, just with the technology, local doesn't have to be like just my next door neighbor. It can be like, there can be like a local community. Like maybe you guys could be local, like, because you're like-minded and that sort of thing. So like, I think that's where you got to focus. And maybe that's where we went wrong, like focus globally, like as such a big complicated thing. Maybe if everyone just stuck locally, and it'd be a little easier.
Yeah. Like if you have that big sort of web, which we've seen work. So we kind of understand how a lot of these ideas work. Now apply that on smaller scale. It probably gets a lot simpler.
Yeah.
Or at least that's how I would deduce it, right? And that makes sense.
More stable.
Yeah, exactly. And like a lot of that makes sense now. Like, I mean, and the thing you kind of run into then is like, I think we rely on having like a lot of abundance. Like basically, I think we have to grow way more than we need just to basically ensure we don't starve, right? Like you probably got to grow like what, 30% over what anyone's going to eat. So and then you kind of you have to throw out a bunch of food, because you see that happen too, where people are kind of throwing out food, right? But,
well, and like there's a huge learning curve too, right? Like, so like my grandparents, they grew most of their own food and they knew what they were doing because they did it from when they were growing up. And like we're lucky because we have my mom and she has all that knowledge, but my brother and I, like we are farming and we are farmers, but like we've only been doing this for 5 years. Like I grew up on a farm, but I didn't really like do that much. I didn't really think about it, but yeah, it takes time to learn all that stuff, whether it's farming with animals or gardening or food preservation or all that stuff. So I think it's important to start and learn.
Yeah, and like you're right too. You know, the idea of having community, talking to like-minded people, helping foster these ideas. So yeah, it's been great talking to you. It was it's great to talk to people who have like minds, and it's great to sort of know what like someone who's actually participating in the market kind of has an idea of what's going on with the global food market in a way. Like it's a good perspective. It's good. That's why we want to talk to lots of farmers. We want to know, you know, what does the food future look like?
Yeah. Well, that's great. I think it's extremely important, and it's exciting in its own way. So I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. So if anyone wants to get a hold of your products, wants to see any of what you got going on, where would they find you? Where would they follow you?
So it's Wild Meadows Farm. WildMeadowsFarm.ca is our website. You can order online and have it delivered right to your door. I run an Instagram page, Wild Meadows Farm. Just search that. That's where I post most of my stuff. Yeah, and if anyone has any questions or whatever, feel free to contact me.
All right, perfect. Thanks so much, Mike.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.